Hi everybody. In this video lecture, I'm going to talk about material culture from the perspective of cultural anthropology. So the title of the lecture is Object Biographies, which refers to one of the sort of theoretical approaches to understanding objects and their relationships with people that was referenced in your reading. So in this lecture, I'm going to talk a little bit about the broader context of how cultural anthropologists address material culture, material life, objects. And then we'll work towards the more specific case that was discussed in the reading by Sonley that you looked at for this unit. So let's go ahead and do that. So by now you've already learned a bit about how archaeologists think about material life. And indeed within anthropology, sort of when you think about material culture, the first subfield that you think about is archaeology, right? Archaeologists sort of by definition engage with material things all the time. It's the way that they do their research. Cultural anthropologists also do so, but in a slightly different way. Because our focus is on living people with whom we are interacting in the course of our research, the material stuff around people is not necessarily sort of the first thing we look at or go to. But material cultural studies, like focus on that as a topic within cultural anthropology, does have a long and rich history. So I thought I'd start by just giving you an idea of some of the key ideas regarding this topic within cultural anthropology. And again, it's a little bit different than the way archaeologists think about it, but it has the same sort of broader context, which is understanding how people and objects interact over time. What are the meaning of those objects and the uses of those objects? And how can we understand both the objects and the people? And what does that tell us about the society of which both those objects and those people were a part? Okay. So let me run through a few, again, key ideas from the study of material culture by cultural anthropologists. I think one of the biggest and most important sort of basic ideas is that cultural anthropologists are focusing not on the objects in a vacuum, right, as separated from people, but really thinking about the relationships between people and objects. And how does that intersection between people and the material world manifest in different places? And again, what does it do for us as a sort of lens to understand the cultural world in which that relationship takes place? So one of the cultural anthropologists who has done a lot of work on this subject is Daniel Miller. And one of the things that Miller argues is that, in fact, subjects, people, are not separate from the objects they interact with, but that essentially we co-create one another, right? So that, in fact, objects are not sort of a byproduct or a side effect of what it means to be human, but are integral to being a person, right? So persons and objects sort of mutually construct one another, if you will, okay? Another key idea is the idea that the material world, the objects we interact with, are closely connected with memory. That is the way that not only individuals, but societies remember things, memorialize the past, bear the past into the present, is really connected to the object world around us. So one example of a cultural anthropologist who has worked a lot on that idea is an anthropologist named Annette Wiener. And she has put it in this way, that she talks about objects accumulating what she calls density. That is, over time, essentially layers of meaning accrue to an object, which enhances its power in the present. So in other words, an object is sort of laden with the history of its usage over time, and that gives it a particular role and a particular power or potency when people make use of it in the present. And then, of course, another key idea about material culture coming from cultural anthropologists is one that you encountered in the reading that you did. And that's the notion of the social lives of objects. And this is an idea associated with Arjun Appadurai, another cultural anthropologist. And what he's talking about when he talks about the social lives of objects is the idea that the paths that objects take and the exchanges that they are engaged in those travels are not unlike the life course of a person. That is, there are sort of relationships that sort of are interacted in across time, across space, and that if we want to understand the objects and again all the people that those objects have touched, then we need to pay attention to and sort of trace out all those moments of again, the highlights of the social life of that object. And we'll talk about this a little bit more when we get into that Sanli article that you read for this unit. So all of these, again, I'm sort of moving through these quickly. I just wanted to sort of introduce you to the kinds of ways that cultural anthropologists think about objects and try to analyze objects, right? So these are some sort of theoretical tools that cultural anthropologists use to try to understand objects and how they relate to people and what they can tell us. One of the things that all of these theoretical tools can help us to do, even just, in this class or in the world as you're thinking about the meanings of objects, is it can help us sort of unpack some of the things we assume about the objects around us. For example, I think many of us would sort of make a distinction between certain kinds of objects and other kinds of objects in terms of how important they are or how special they are. We might make distinctions, for example, between something we consider to be a ritual object or a sacred object versus just an everyday object, right? Which I think we tend to think of as being, again, less meaningful, less special, less important to attend to. We might make distinctions between objects that we consider to be permanent or durable versus objects that are ephemeral or are just going to be sort of temporary, right? Or disposable. Like there's so many objects we interact with in the modern world that are temporary by nature, right? They're made to be thrown away. So we might think like there's got to be a difference there. I think a common distinction we make is between objects that are handmade or one of a kind, right, versus things that are mass produced. So once we start, though, applying some of these theoretical tools that I've just described to you, some of those distinctions start to break down. And I think the lesson here is that we need to be a lot more critical. So toward that end of being more critical about these different sorts of presumed categories of objects, I'm going to give you a few examples where I think some of those distinctions I referred to actually are quite blurred. So one of the distinctions is between something considered a ritual or sacred object and something considered a mundane everyday object. The image on the slide here is from a practice sometimes referred to as a cargo cult. In this case, in Tanna on the island of Vanuatu in the South Pacific, where people who live in this island engage in a practice that has taken place since the end of World War II, when people in this area had contact with American soldiers. And what has happened over time is that the islanders have come to make use of American or Americanized objects in ritual practices that are meant to essentially call wealth and goods to the island, and to hasten the arrival of a prophetic figure. So what you see people using are things like blue jeans, and these are sort of props meant to emulate guns, right? So the everyday item of a pair of American blue jeans that we would think of as, far from a special or a sacred object, in this context is being used in a ritual practice. Likewise, the distinction between what we consider to be sort of permanent or durable objects versus the ephemeral objects, things that are disposable, that they're going to sort of be tossed aside. We often think of particularly famous pieces of art as things that last forever, that have this sort of staying power, that become part of sort of everyone's general understanding of what is in the world. So the famous painting, The Scream, might be considered an example of that. However, the fact of the matter is that The Scream has been changing for many years. What the curators of the museum where it's held have found is that it's been prone to change that is brought about by humidity. So contact with humid air has actually degraded some of the colors in the painting and turned particularly the yellow colors to white, such that it has been kept, in fact, in storage for the last 15 years or so now, to keep it away from light, humidity, and higher temperatures. So again, the idea that this is a permanent or durable object starts to fall away. First of all, the thing is changing over time, so it's not the painting it was originally. And second of all, for it to exist at all in something like its original state, it needs to be hidden away. So there's that sort of question of to what extent is it an object in the world if it has to be kept in the basement of a museum? So again, the distinction between a durable or a permanent object and a ephemeral one that will shift over time or disappear starts to go away, or at least become a more blurred boundary as we start to look at it more critically. And then finally, the distinction between handmade or sort of personal objects and mass-produced commodities. Here's an image from a particular collector's collection of vintage Star Wars figurines. Something that is, absolutely mass-produced. In theory, they're all the same. There were a lot in circulation, but over time, both from keeping them and from collecting them into one place, they start to accrue value and meaning that goes beyond what we typically think of for something like a mass-produced toy. So again, the idea here is to use some of these theoretical tools that cultural anthropologists provide to think more critically about the objects in our world and the objects we engage in or engage with. So one of these tools that you saw in action a little bit in what you were reading this week is a Paterais notion of the social lives of things. And what a Paterais says is that, or what he suggests, is that we follow the thing. In other words, trace the journeys of particular objects through the various steps of production and consumption and exchange that they. So, for example, a Paterais says, the transactions that surround things are invested with the properties of social relations. So in other words, not unlike a person or a person's life course. He continues, thus, today's gift is tomorrow's commodity. Yesterday's commodity is tomorrow's found art object. Today's art object is tomorrow's junk, and yesterday's junk is tomorrow's heirloom. All things are congealed moments in a longer social trajectory. So again, the suggestion here is that you follow the object, follow the thing, and through tracing its path and taking note of its various sort of interactions with other people, objects, etc., we can get a better understanding of the role of that object and the meaning it plays in people's lives. So this takes us to the Sonley piece that you read. And Sonley is drawing on a Paterais theory and trying to make use of it. But Sonley also has a couple of critiques of this idea of follow the thing, of the social lives of objects. The first is that Sonley suggests that a Paterais model is too linear, that it suggests, again, a life course or a trajectory that is too much of a unidirectional trajectory, right? That it's one path. Instead, Sonley suggests that the meanings of objects are overlapping and competing as they travel through various contexts. So in other words, it's not a path or a journey or an itinerary. It's actually multiple trajectories that intersect in various ways. So it's something more like a tree, right, with multiple branches than a singular line or a singular path. And the example that Sonley's using to demonstrate this is the material culture connected with forced migration and the way that those objects have, particularly in recent years, been presented in museums. There have been a number of museum shows and work by artists as well that display the objects and material elements attached to forced migration, particularly those objects connected to crossing borders, particularly crossing borders without documentation, right? So again, forced migrations or migrations that are done under duress. As sort of a side note, you'll see that Sonley refers to this kind of work as archaeological ethnography, or the archaeology of the contemporary. So again, I think that's just a sign of how connected and, in fact, sort of overlapping the work of cultural anthropologists and archaeologists is in addressing objects and what it means for an object to interact with people's lives. So, as I say, there's a sort of been an increasing number of museum shows and work as well both by artists and by anthropologists and others on the material culture connected to forced migration. And Sonley gives us a couple of examples. I want to show you some images of those. So one is the artist Ai Weiwei, whose piece Safe Passage entailed a display of life vests used by migrants that were displayed in front of the Minneapolis Art Museum. Another project or show along these lines was that done by Jason DeLeon, who is an anthropologist, in fact, and is called State of Exception. These displays include backpacks that were used by migrants to cross the U.S.-Mexico border. And then finally, a third show that the article references is that at the Anthropology Museum at Brown University. It's a show called Transient Matters, where they displayed, among other things, they displayed also some of the life vests and other materials, but also a photography exhibit of the material culture from the Moria refugee camp in Greece. So again, all of these shows are sort of taking stock of the stuff associated with the lives of people crossing borders, particularly crossing borders under duress, and how spending some time thinking about those objects can help us think about not only those people's lives, but those issues and those phenomena. Sonley points out that objects in museums in general raise some questions, and these particular objects being displayed in these shows also raise some very specific questions. So I wanted to talk a little bit about, again, these sort of critical points that Sonley makes that are very much a part of this question of how to think about these objects. The first is that there's been all kinds of ethical questions about museums raised in the past and in the present, including those by anthropologists and, to some extent, about the work of anthropologists in conjunction with museums. So, for example, particularly for Native American groups in the United States, there's been a lot of concern about museum collections that include either human remains collected in the past, but that can be attributed to Native American tribes that exist in the present, and museum collections that include sacred objects that contemporary tribe members want to reclaim and to have ownership of. A lot of the issues around this shifted in 1990 with the advent of what is called the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act. It's often abbreviated as NAGPRA. And that was a piece of legislation that gave Native American groups more leverage to make claims on materials being held by museums. Some of these are items that have been in museums for a long time, right? So something that was collected 100 years ago. So the question became sort of who owns that, or who should own that? Particularly items that are collected to a particular heritage. It becomes a real ethical conundrum for a museum to continue to hold on to that. So, for example, here's just one case of that, a very recent one, where the Portland Art Museum agreed to repatriate the object shown here to the Tlingit people. That was in 2022. So there have been, again, especially since 1990, a lot of cases where museums have started to participate or collaborate with Native American groups to get sacred objects and human remains that were previously in their collections back into the hands of what are considered to be the rightful owners. So again, Sanli's raising not exactly this case of this killer whale hat, but the broader question of how museums sort of owning certain kinds of material culture and then displaying it is already a sort of ethically complex issue. The second issue that Sanli raises is about the particular objects that these kinds of shows tend to focus on, which is those objects sort of left behind at the border and in the moment of the border crossing. And the point she makes regarding that is that this is only telling one part of the story, right? So there's a couple important points. The first is Sanli's main argument, which is that objects have not just one social life, as a Paterai would suggest, but multiple lives, and that each of these lives has its own meaning and context and relevance. So indeed, we need to trace the multiple social lives of any particular object if we really want to understand its significance. The second point made is that focusing just on some objects tends to truncate the overall journey that people are making and the many worlds that these objects intersect with. That in fact, focusing just, for example, on the life vests discarded by migrants at the moment that they cross the border doesn't fully portray either the lives of those objects or the ways they've intersected with multiple human lives. So Sanli takes, just as an example to demonstrate this, just one life jacket from Lesbos, which is in Greece and where a lot of these migrants end up entering the country, and said, we can really expand our understanding of the multiple lives of that one life jacket. So, for example, I'll lead you through these photographs that I threw together to sort of demonstrate the multiple lives of this life jacket as it moves from one social sphere to another. So over here we have, this is an image from a Chinese factory where life vests are produced. So the creation of the object may start in a totally different part of the world and with a totally different set of people. Then that particular life jacket is used by a migrant crossing over the Aegean or the Mediterranean to reach their destination. The life jacket is then discarded. This is sometimes referred to it as a life jacket cemetery, where many migrants cross. There will develop a sort of a large quantity of these objects, right? Which is where some of these museums are taking these from. The life jacket is discarded here. Then it is taken up by a museum curator who includes the life jacket in a museum display as part of a discussion of migration worldwide. And then finally, as was mentioned in the Sanli article, refugees themselves in the new country use those life jackets to create something new. Sanli mentions that there was a project where refugees made use of the discarded life jackets to create bags, right, to sell to support their cause. So we see here the same object moving through multiple lives of its own and touching on multiple human lives, right? From the factory worker to the migrant during their journey to the curators and patrons of a museum to a refugee community now settled in a new country. So again, the point here is that objects have multiple lives and that fully tracing them across various social and material spheres is a way to really get a handle on the meaning and relationship between people and things. So I'll stop there. I hope you enjoy the unit and we'll talk soon. Bye-bye.